The restaurant hummed with the quiet chatter of wealthy patrons, crystal glasses clinking under the soft glow of chandeliers. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved swiftly between tables, ensuring every demand of their elite guests was met without hesitation. Ryan, one of the waiters, balanced a tray of entrees when a sharp, gasping sound cut through the air. He turned just in time to see an elderly woman clutching her throat, her face turning a frightening shade of red. Panic spread through the restaurant. No one moved. Without a second thought, Ryan dropped his tray and rushed forward. Wrapping his arms around her frail frame, he performed the Heimlich maneuver. Once, twice, until finally, a lodged piece of steak flew out of her mouth. She inhaled sharply, coughing but alive. He had just saved her life. A breathless silence hung in the air. Then, whispers, stares, cold, judgmental eyes. Before Ryan could even step back, his manager stormed over, his face twisted in rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Ryan? You're fired." Ryan's stomach dropped. Fired? For saving someone? The old lady looked at him, shaken, but she said nothing. Then, outside, a sleek black car pulled up, and a man stepped out. Everything was about to change. Ryan pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the restaurant, stepping out into the cold night air. His hands clenched around his crumpled apron, his chest tight with humiliation. Fired. For saving someone's life. Behind him, muffled murmurs and clinking glasses continued inside the lavish dining hall, as if nothing had happened. The same people who had watched an old woman nearly die were now back to their wine and expensive meals, whispering only about the disturbance rather than the life that had been saved. Ryan exhaled sharply, staring at the sidewalk beneath his feet. How had it come to this? It had taken Ryan 3 months to find this job. 3 months of rejection after rejection, his savings shrinking to almost nothing. Bills piling up. The stress of surviving in a world that barely gave him a chance. Then, one evening, he had walked into the Sterling Room, the finest restaurant in the city, and begged for a chance. Greg, the manager, had looked him up and down, sneering slightly. "You've got experience?" Ryan had nodded. "I worked at a bistro for 2 years. Greg had scoffed. "We don't do bistro service here, kid. We cater to a different class of people." A different class. Ryan had known exactly what he meant. Still, he had swallowed his pride. "I'll learn. Just give me a chance." And somehow, Greg had agreed. But not without making it clear that Ryan was the lowest of the low on the staff. From day one, Greg had made Ryan's life hell. Ryan was the only black employee in the entire restaurant. The other waiters, mostly white, some rich college kids who worked for fun, they ignored him, laughing among themselves, treating him like he didn't belong. But Greg had gone out of his way to make things worse. He assigned Ryan the worst tables, the ones nobody wanted, full of drunk, rude customers who would snap their fingers at him like a servant. If Ryan took an order even a second too late, Greg would yell at him in front of customers, "Get your act together, Ryan! Or maybe this job's too much for you." He never gave Ryan good shifts, always making sure he worked the slowest, least profitable nights. And worst of all, he always watched him, always doubted him. And tonight, Greg had finally found his excuse. The moment Ryan had placed his hands on the old lady to save her life, he had seen Greg's expression twist into one of disgust. Greg hadn't seen a heroic act. He had seen a black man touching a wealthy white woman. That was all it took. "You're disturbing the customers, Ryan," Greg had shouted in front of everyone. "You're making them uncomfortable. This is a fine establishment, not some low-end diner." Uncomfortable? Ryan had saved a woman from choking. How was that uncomfortable? Ryan had turned then, desperate, looking at the old woman whose life he had just saved. She had been sitting up now, breathing, recovering, still looking shaken. This was her chance to speak up. To tell Greg the truth. To tell him that Ryan had saved her. But as the restaurant's wealthy customers stared at her, waiting for her reaction, she had hesitated. Her eyes darted around the table, at the pearl-clad women who looked appalled, at the men who shook their heads as if Ryan had done something inappropriate. Ryan saw the fear in her eyes. And then, she lowered her gaze to her lap. She said nothing. She let Greg fire him. Ryan had stood there, stunned. She wasn't going to defend him. He had done nothing wrong. He had saved her. And still, he was the villain. With no paycheck, no job, and no justice, he had been forced to remove his apron and walk out in disgrace. Now, standing alone on the sidewalk, his fingers clenched around the fabric, he felt an overwhelming mix of anger, betrayal, and exhaustion. He wanted to scream, to go back inside, to demand an apology, to make them see how wrong they were. But he knew better. They wouldn't care. They never did. Taking a deep breath, he turned away from the restaurant, his mind racing with what to do next. Then, he heard it. The low hum of a car engine pulling up behind him. Ryan glanced over his shoulder just as the black luxury sedan rolled to a stop. The back door opened. A tall, older man in a sleek, tailored suit stepped out. His silver hair was neatly combed, his watch gleaming under the streetlights. Ryan stared at him, confused. The man's eyes locked onto him, sharp and assessing. Then, in a calm, controlled voice, he spoke. "Waiter, you saved my wife today." Ryan felt his breath catch, her husband, and by the look on his face, everything was about to change. The night air was crisp, but Ryan barely felt it. His thoughts were a storm of anger and disbelief, his steps heavy with humiliation as he walked down the dimly lit sidewalk. The sounds of the city, distant honking, the occasional chatter from people leaving late-night restaurants, faded into the background. All he could hear was Greg's voice echoing in his head. "You're disturbing the customers, Ryan." "This is a fine establishment." He clenched his jaw, gripping his crumpled apron. He had done nothing wrong, yet he had been thrown away like trash. Then, behind him, a low hum of an engine made him pause. A car was following him. Ryan glanced over his shoulder and immediately tensed. A sleek black luxury sedan was trailing him, its headlights dimmed but unmistakably tracking his movements. Instinct kicked in. Was Greg sending someone after him? Was he about to get harassed, threatened, worse? He wasn't about to stick around to find out. He picked up his pace. The car matched his speed. His heart pounded. His fists clenched tighter around the apron. He didn't have money for a cab, and his apartment was still 10 blocks away. Then, the car pulled over to the curb. The back door swung open. A tall man, elegantly dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, stepped out. Under the glow of a nearby street lamp, his silver hair gleamed, perfectly styled, his sharp features unreadable. A glint of an expensive watch peeked from beneath his sleeve as he adjusted his cuff. His presence alone screamed power, authority, wealth. Ryan froze. Who the hell was this guy? The man didn't speak at first. He just stood there, watching Ryan, studying him. Ryan instinctively took a step back. The stranger gave a slight nod, and the driver, dressed in a crisp black uniform, silently returned to the car. Ryan's chest tightened. This wasn't normal. He had seen men like this before. Powerful men, rich men, men who owned cities and crushed anyone in their way. And they never spoke unless they wanted something. Ryan forced himself to stay calm. "Look, man, I don't have any money." His voice was tight. "If this is some kind of—" The man finally spoke. His voice was steady, deep, composed. "Waiter." Ryan stiffened. "You saved my wife today." The words sent a chill down Ryan's spine. So this was her husband. The powerful man stared at him, his expression unreadable. Ryan's pulse quickened. Was this guy here to thank him? To punish him? To buy his silence? He had no idea. But something in the way the man held his gaze told him one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Ryan squared his shoulders, keeping his distance as the older man studied him. The man's gaze was intense, calculating, the kind of look that made it clear he was used to getting what he wanted. Then, without a word, he reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, white envelope. With a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed it toward Ryan. The envelope landed at Ryan's feet with a soft thud, its weight unmistakable. The flap slightly parted, revealing a thick stack of crisp $100 bills inside. Ryan's jaw tightened. "For your trouble," the man said smoothly, as if he were tipping a valet. Ryan stared at the money. Everything inside him screamed to walk away. He looked up, meeting the man's unreadable gaze. "I don't need your money," Ryan said coldly. "I need my job back." The man's expression didn't change, but Ryan caught the flicker of surprise in his sharp blue eyes. Then, a smirk. It was the kind of smirk that suggested amusement, curiosity, and maybe a bit of respect. "That's not what I expected you to say," the man admitted, slipping his hands into his pockets. Ryan exhaled through his nose, ignoring the heavy envelope at his feet. "I don't know who you are, and honestly, I don't care," Ryan said firmly. "If you came here to throw hush money at me and pretend none of this happened, you're wasting your time." For a moment, the man said nothing. Then, with a slow chuckle, he took a step closer. "Do you even know who I am?" Ryan clenched his fists. "Number." "And like I said, I don't care." The man tilted his head slightly. "Interesting." He turned, gesturing at the sleek black car behind him. "That building you just got fired from? The one your manager thinks he owns?" Ryan narrowed his eyes. Where was this going? The man let the silence stretch before delivering his next words with quiet confidence. "I own it." Ryan's stomach dropped. He blinked, processing what he just heard. The man extended his hand. "Richard Whitmore, billionaire real estate investor. That restaurant is just one of the many properties I own in this city." Ryan's pulse pounded in his ears. Billionaire. The Whitmore name clicked immediately. The Whitmore family was practically royalty. They owned hotels, luxury condos, restaurants, you name it. And now, one of them was standing right in front of Ryan, smirking as if this was all some kind of game. Ryan crossed his arms. "So what? You came to pay me off?" Richard let out a slow breath. "No, Ryan. I came to offer you something better." He took another step closer, lowering his voice just enough to make Ryan lean in slightly. "I need someone like you." Ryan frowned. "What?" "Someone who doesn't bow to power. Someone who does what's right, even when it costs them everything." Richard's eyes held an intensity that made Ryan's skin prickle. "I don't trust men like you." Ryan's voice was steady, but his mind raced. What was Whitmore playing at? Richard studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Good. You shouldn't." That caught Ryan off guard. Richard smirked again. "Tell you what. If you don't want my money, let's talk about getting your revenge." Ryan froze. His pulse kicked up a notch. Revenge. He had spent the last hour trying to push the anger down, trying to accept what had happened. Now, this man was offering him something he didn't even realize he wanted. Ryan swallowed, his voice low. "I'm listening." Ryan folded his arms. His gaze locked onto Richard. "Revenge? Against Greg?" Richard smirked, stepping closer, his voice dropping just slightly. "That's right. And trust me, he deserves it." Ryan narrowed his eyes. "Why do you care?" The billionaire let out a slow breath, glancing toward the city skyline before turning back to Ryan. "Greg thinks he owns this town. He forgets that I own him." Ryan raised a brow. "What does that mean?" Richard chuckled. "It means Greg is a parasite. A small man pretending to be powerful because he runs a fancy restaurant. He treats people like trash because he thinks no one can touch him." Ryan scoffed. "You're rich too. What makes you any different?" Richard's smirk faded. "Because unlike Greg, I don't prey on people who can't fight back." His eyes gleamed with something colder, more dangerous. "And because I've been waiting for the perfect excuse to crush him." Ryan hesitated. Something about the way Richard spoke. He wasn't just playing games. He meant every word. "Why do you hate him so much?" Ryan asked. Richard sighed, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "Because I gave that man a chance once, and he spit in my face. Richard leaned against the sleek black car, crossing his arms. 15 years ago, Greg wasn't running restaurants. He was running scams. Ryan frowned. Scams? Richard nodded. He used to work for one of my businesses, a hotel. He was a low-level manager, ambitious but dirty. I caught him skimming from our accounts. Not just a little. He stole thousands from customers using fake service fees. Ryan's stomach twisted. What happened? Richard smirked bitterly. I could have ruined him. Instead, I let him walk away quietly, thinking maybe he'd change. Instead, he took what he learned from me and built this little empire of corruption. Ryan exhaled sharply. So, he's been doing this for years? Richard nodded. He's laundering money through that restaurant, overcharging customers, underpaying staff, dodging taxes. But he's smart about it. No one's been able to pin anything on him. Ryan clenched his jaw. So what's the plan? You want to take him down? How? Richard's smirk returned. Easy. We expose him. Ryan hesitated. I'm not a criminal. Richard laughed. Who said anything about crime? We're just exposing the truth. Ryan stared at him. And how do you plan to do that? Richard stepped forward, eyes gleaming. Simple. You go back in there. Ryan blinked. You want me to walk back into the place that just fired me? Richard grinned. Oh, not as a waiter. A flicker of curiosity sparked in Ryan's chest. Then as what? Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black folder. He flipped it open, revealing a legal contract. This, he said, handing it to Ryan, makes you the official manager of the Sterling Room. Ryan's eyes widened. Wait, what? Richard chuckled. Greg thinks he owns that restaurant. What he doesn't know is that he actually leases it. From me. And I just decided it's time for a management change. Ryan flipped through the contract, his heart pounding. He wasn't being offered a payout. He was being offered control. You want me to run it? Ryan asked, still stunned. Richard nodded. Not forever. Just long enough to get inside and expose every dirty trick Greg has been pulling. Ryan took a deep breath. And what happens after that? Richard's smirk widened. Then we burn his empire to the ground. Ryan's hands trembled as he stared at the contract. For months, he had been humiliated, tossed aside, treated like less than nothing by men like Greg. Now, Richard was offering him the chance to turn the tables. For the first time in a long time, Ryan held the power. He slowly met Richard's gaze, then extended his hand. Deal. The Sterling Room was buzzing with its usual crowd. Wealthy elites sipping their overpriced wine, laughing in hushed tones, oblivious to the storm about to hit. Greg stood near the bar, wearing his usual smug expression, basking in the glow of his power. The same man who had fired Ryan without hesitation was completely unaware that his reign was about to end. Then, the doors swung open. Ryan stepped inside, and this time, he wasn't wearing an apron. A sharp gasp rippled through the room as the staff and customers recognized him immediately. But before anyone could react, another figure stepped in behind him. Richard Whitmore, a billionaire in an impeccably tailored suit, radiating power. And just like that, the restaurant fell dead silent. Greg, who had been smirking at first, suddenly stiffened. His face drained of color as his eyes locked onto Richard. He knew this wasn't good. But still, Greg tried to play it off. Mr. Whitmore, he said, forcing a laugh. Didn't expect to see you here. What brings you in? Richard smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile that sent shivers down spines. I came to deal with some unfinished business. Then, he snapped his fingers. The doors burst open again, and 3 sharp-dressed lawyers entered, carrying stacks of thick legal documents. They moved swiftly, slamming files onto Greg's desk. One of them handed him a letter. Greg's smirk vanished instantly. His fingers trembled as he unfolded the paper and read the first few lines. Then, his eyes widened in horror. What is this? He stammered. Richard adjusted his cufflinks. That, Greg, is your end. No, 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 Greg muttered, flipping through the pages frantically. Oh yes, Richard said, his voice smooth but deadly. Fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, wage theft. You've been very busy, haven't you? The restaurant staff looked at each other, whispering in shock. Greg shook his head violently. This is a mistake! Ryan stepped forward now, crossing his arms. The only mistake was thinking you could keep getting away with it. Greg snapped his head toward him, eyes burning with rage. You did this. Ryan just smirked. Not me, Greg. You did it to yourself. Greg turned back to Richard, his panic escalating. This is a setup. You can't do this. Richard tilted his head. Greg, I own this building. I own the lease you signed. I own the property, the permits, and every record tied to this business. His voice dropped to a whisper. And now, I own you. A bead of sweat rolled down Greg's forehead. Then, the front doors flew open again. 2 uniformed officers walked in. The moment Greg saw the badges, the handcuffs, he knew it was over. Greg Thompson, one of the officers said. You're under arrest. Gasps filled the restaurant. Greg whirled around, looking at the customers, the waiters, desperate for someone to defend him. But no one did. Not a single person. Because everyone had hated him. His own staff broke into cheers. The servers and bartenders who had spent years under Greg's rule clapped, laughed, some even shouted in celebration. "'Bout damn time!" one of the cooks yelled. "Hope you rot in prison, Greg!" Another server spat. Greg's face contorted in pure disbelief. He had spent years bullying, cheating, and stealing. And now? No one was on his side. As the officers dragged him forward, Greg shouted at Richard one last time. "You set me up, you son of a—" Richard merely smiled, watching calmly as Greg was cuffed and escorted out. As the restaurant doors swung shut behind him, a strange silence settled over the place. Then slowly, every pair of eyes in the room turned to Ryan. The whispers began immediately. "Isn't that the waiter they fired? Wait. He took Greg down? I thought he was just some nobody." Ryan let them talk. Then, with complete control, he turned toward the remaining staff, the people Greg had mistreated for years. He smiled. "All right, folks, let's get back to work." The staff roared in approval. Ryan took a deep breath, letting the satisfaction sink in. Greg was gone. The restaurant was finally free. And most importantly, the guy who saved a life just saved an entire business too. The cold night air felt different now, lighter, freer. Ryan and Richard stepped outside, leaving behind the chaos inside the Sterling Room. The restaurant that once symbolized Ryan's humiliation now stood under new leadership. The weight of injustice that had pressed against his chest for weeks had finally lifted. But there was still one question lingering in his mind. Why had Richard helped him? Ryan turned to the billionaire, his brows furrowed. "You didn't have to do all this. Why did you—" Richard let out a slow breath, looking up at the night sky as if lost in a distant memory. Then he spoke, his voice softer than before. "Because I was you once." Ryan blinked, surprised. "What?" Richard gestured toward the restaurant. "I worked there, years ago. Not as the owner, not even as a manager. I was a dishwasher." Ryan's head snapped toward him. Richard Whitmore, billionaire real estate mogul, had been a dishwasher? Richard chuckled at his expression. "Surprising, isn't it? People look at me now and assume I was born into wealth. But I wasn't. I grew up poor, working dead-end jobs just to keep food on the table." Ryan crossed his arms, listening intently. "Greg was there back then too," Richard continued, his voice hardening. "He wasn't the owner, just another manager. But even then, he was the same arrogant bastard you knew him as." Ryan could already guess where this was going. Richard's jaw clenched. "He used to humiliate me, called me just a peasant in front of customers, mocked me for dreaming bigger, said people like me don't move up in the world." Ryan stayed silent, feeling a familiar sting in his chest. That same humiliation, that same doubt, he had felt it too. "I never forgot it," Richard admitted, his hands slipping into his pockets. I made myself a promise that day, that no one like Greg would ever have power over me again. Ryan exhaled slowly. Now, it made sense. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about breaking the cycle. Richard looked at Ryan then, his sharp blue eyes filled with something Ryan hadn't expected, understanding. I saw myself in you, Ryan. The words hit Ryan harder than he expected. A hardworking man who did the right thing, even when it cost him everything. Someone no one respected, no one valued. Richard's lips curled into a smirk. I was once in your shoes. Now I wear the ones that step on men like Greg. Ryan couldn't help but let out a short laugh, shaking his head. That's one way to put it. Richard nodded toward the thick envelope still tucked in his pocket. You could take the money now, Ryan. Call it a fresh start. No strings attached. Ryan glanced at it, then back at Richard. Then, he did something that surprised even himself. He shook his head. I don't want your money. Richard raised a brow. No? Ryan's grip tightened at his sides. I want a chance. For a second, Richard just stared at him. Then he smiled. A genuine one this time. Good answer. He turned slightly, pulling a sleek business card from his pocket and flicking it toward Ryan. Show up at my office tomorrow, Richard said. Let's see what you're made of. Ryan caught the card between his fingers, staring at the embossed letters. Whitmore Enterprises. His heart pounded. He had walked into this restaurant as a waiter. Now, he was walking away with something much bigger than a paycheck, a future. 1 year later. The Sterling Room was no longer a high-end restaurant catering only to the elite. The chandeliers still sparkled, the wooden floors still gleamed, but the air inside was different now. Warmer, livelier. Laughter replaced hushed whispers, the scent of freshly cooked meals filled the space, and the tables were full of people who actually needed them. Because this wasn't the Sterling Room anymore. It was now the community table. Ryan stood at the front of the room, watching as families, workers, and struggling individuals ate without fear of being judged. No one was snapping their fingers at the staff. No one was looking down on the people who walked through the doors. Instead, they were greeting each other, sharing meals, and rebuilding their lives. And Ryan? He wasn't a waiter anymore. He was the one running it all. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, Ryan moved through the dining hall with the same ease he had once carried trays. But now, he wasn't just taking orders. He was giving them. Behind the counter, a young man in an apron rushed past, balancing plates on his arms, struggling to keep up. Ryan chuckled and clapped him on the back. You're moving too fast, man. Pace yourself, all right? The waiter nodded, breathless. Sorry, boss. Just trying to keep up. Ryan smiled. I know the feeling. He looked across the room at the staff, people who, just a year ago, had been in his shoes. Some were former waiters who had worked under Greg, finally treated with dignity. Others were people like him, once underestimated, now given a real chance. A chance, just like Richard had given him. Ryan stepped outside for a breath of fresh air, standing on the steps of the restaurant, watching the city buzz around him. Everything had changed. He had spent his whole life believing people like him would always be stuck at the bottom, that men like Greg would always win. But standing here now, running his own business, giving others a place to belong, he realized how wrong he had been. Greg? A distant memory. After his arrest, his empire crumbled. The wealthy elites who once praised him pretended they never knew him. The man who thought he was untouchable? Now forgotten. A familiar black car pulled up to the curb. Ryan turned as the door opened. Richard Whitmore stepped out, dressed just as sharply as ever. But this time, he wasn't the intimidating billionaire who had once tossed an envelope of cash at Ryan's feet. He was the man who saw something in him before anyone else did. Richard smirked. Not bad, kid. Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. Funny how life changes, huh? Richard's eyes gleamed. Yeah. And this is just the beginning. Ryan smiled. Yeah, it was.